Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends of ICCT, it is my great pleasure to welcome you here in The Hague or online to the annual conference of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. For those who do not know us, ICCT is an independent think and do tank dedicated to shaping effective and evidence-based policies against terrorism grounded in human rights and the rule of law. The theme of this year's conference is Global Power Politics, Counterterrorism and Human Rights, which we believe is a timely and relevant issue to our field. The purpose of this event is to reflect all together on this important theme, but also to bring together people from different backgrounds and with different perspectives, researchers, practitioners and policymakers, people from Europe and beyond. We have prepared a great program for over 2 days with keynote speakers and plenary sessions, but also some smaller workshops focused, for instance, on the Sahel region, the use of mercenaries in counterterrorism, or the link between disinformation, including state disinformation, and far-right extremism. The conference is also a way to highlight some of our key achievements this year, which will be done in a few minutes by my colleague Alex von Rosenbach. We have some exciting news to share, so stay on, please. But I already wanted to express how impressed I am with the work of the amazing people here at ICCT. I am truly privileged to work here with this team. You may not know all of them, you might not see all of them, but this conference, like any other ICCT activity, couldn't take place without them. So I wanted to already now thank the whole ICCT team. This year's annual conference takes place against the background of Russia's war in Ukraine and the growing tensions between Western nations and China, but also the recent withdrawals of Western forces from Afghanistan or the Sahel. International relations, it seems, are increasingly heading towards great powers rivalry, if not already driven by it. In preparing this conference, I reflected on these evolutions, trying to unpack some potential consequences for counterterrorism. Allow me to share some thoughts as context for the next sessions. 30 years ago, the collapse of the Soviet Union was celebrated by many as the end of history and the triumph of Western liberal values. This was America's unipolar moment, in the words of a famous US commentator. The liberal order had prevailed, and the only challenge was to integrate Russia, China, and others into it. Some pockets of resistance to Western values and perceived US imperialism remained, of course, notably among the emerging global jihadi movement, but these were considered as marginal nuisance. In early 2001, terrorism was nowhere near the top of the list of international priorities. The 9/11 terrorist attacks were a shock in that regard, but also a shock that tilted the focus of international relations towards the fight against international terrorism. Relations among global and emerging powers became framed in part through the prism of counterterrorism cooperation, the infamous "you are with us or against us." In the face of a common enemy, Russia or China were no longer strategic adversaries, but rather partners, according to the 2002 US National Security Strategy. The so-called global war on terror had many flaws and excesses, as we know. One of its major flaws was not about CT per se, however. Many analysts now concur that the war on terror weakened US foreign policy and distracted US and European attention away from more strategic issues, notably related to global order. Indeed, in retrospect, the most important strategic event of 2001 was perhaps not the 9/11 attacks, but rather China's accession to the World Trade Organization, which was a turning point in China's economic ascension. The global crisis of 2008 was another turning point. There were many signs at the time that a tectonic shift was shaking the global system. The formalization of regular meetings between emerging powers like China, Brazil, India, and Brazil under the BRIC acronym was just one sign that we had entered what Fareed Zakaria called the post-American world. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the China-Africa Forum, became new laboratories for building alternative narratives to Western-led values and multilateral institutions, in addition to serving as hubs for cooperation on several issues, including counterterrorism. 20 years ago, international counterterrorism overshadowed global power politics. Today, counterterrorism is largely subsumed under global power rivalry. Geopolitics is back, and counterterrorism must adapt. The situation on the African continent illustrates this evolution. In a recent interview, the former head of US AFRICOM declared that the so-called strategic competition with China and Russia has now become the main preoccupation of the US in Africa, although recognizing that Africa has become the central focus of terrorism in the world. In Africa, like in many other regions, disentangling strategic competition and counterterrorism is becoming increasingly challenging. It is often said that terrorism is politics, but the corollary is also true. Counterterrorism is politics as well. Counterterrorism is a public policy like any other, and it is part of global power politics like any other issues. Thus, if global politics change, it is worth reflecting on the implications for counterterrorism policies at the regional and global levels. 3 years ago, the EU revised its policy on China. After having described China as a strategic partner for almost 2 decades, the EU offered a more nuanced position, describing the country simultaneously as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. In fact, over the past 3 years, the EU's position has clearly tilted towards a more confrontational approach, with growing concerns expressed about the authoritarian shift in China's politics, for instance. In the US as well, China is now overwhelmingly perceived as a global competitor, as described in the latest national security strategy, and strategic rivalry or strategic competition is by far the dominant analytical lens for US-China relations. China's counterterrorism policy, once praised in the post-9/11 context, is now subject to heavy criticism, even at the United Nations. Russia is no longer a partner in the fight against terrorism either, but a terrorist state, according to several European governments. In the United States, some voices call for the government to list Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, a non-glamorous list that contains so far only 4 other countries: Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria. Relations with Russia had already been deteriorating for some time before this year, notably as a result of the annexation of Crimea in 2014 or Russia's war crimes in Syria. From a strategic partner, Russia was re-evaluated as a strategic challenge in the EU's 2016 global strategy. The US latest national security strategy makes no concession, calling Russia an immediate and persistent threat to international peace and stability. Ladies and gentlemen, international relations are set on a new trajectory, one of strategic competition that will raise many risks and challenges. Counterterrorism will also be impacted by this evolution, and it is exactly the aim of this conference to reflect on this with you. Throughout the 2 days of workshops, panels, and keynote speeches, we will seek to address some of the following key questions. What is the impact of the growing rivalry among great and regional powers on the global counterterrorism agenda? More specifically, will global competition result in less or no cooperation on counterterrorism and counter-extremism in terms of CT operation, but also in the donors' programming and co-financing, for instance? In spite of strategic competition, are there still possible areas for cooperation among global powers, bilaterally or in specific regions like Africa? Could great powers rivalry result in more competition in the CT space in certain areas, of which Syria, for instance, could be just a foretaste? In terms of policy attention and resources, will great powers rivalry result in a lesser attention and resources for CT and PCV issues? And what will be the implication if some groups or regions become neglected? Could counterterrorism become one lever that great powers use to build their respective spheres of influence? Conversely, could they use terrorism and proxy wars as a way to weaken their strategic rivals? Are we, for instance, likely to see more state-sponsored terrorism? At the global multilateral level, can there still be a global CT agenda? Or is the global disconnect among global powers too wide to bridge? And finally, can human rights still be at the center of the international counterterrorism agenda when liberal norms and institutions are increasingly criticized and sidelined by both non-Western and Western nations? This makes obviously a lot of questions. I'm not sure that we'll be able to address them all, let alone answer them. However, I do know that we have excellent speakers to take a shot at them. And to begin with, I would like to give the floor to Mina Noor, Head of Counter-Terrorism and National Security Division, Special Envoy for Counterterrorism at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been a long-standing partner and supporter of ICCT's activities since our creation in 2010, and it is therefore my great pleasure to give the floor to Mina for some introductory remarks.
Just a bit of water. Everyone can hear me now. Good. Good afternoon, dear guests. Pleasure to be here with you. And let me start by thanking Thomas for his kind and welcoming words, but also for sharing actually very, very important questions with all of us that we at the ministry as policymakers are breaking our heads on a daily basis. And I'm very, very happy to have and see a lot of brain capacity gathered together by ICCT to at least discuss some of these questions. Today's conference by ICCT, it's an important one and a timely one. Important because terrorism in all its forms, it's still a major threat to international peace and security, which still impacts the lives of millions. In fact, it is important to note that despite the decline of terrorist attacks in Europe and in the US, 2021 actually saw an overall rise in attacks. According to the Global Terrorism Index, it was more than 5,000 in 2021. The fact that we in the West are no longer regularly confronted with terrorism does not mean that the threat has subsided. On the contrary, violent extremists are becoming more savvy, using more advanced methods such as drones, cyber warfare, GPS, and encrypted messaging systems to spread terror. The theater has also shifted, as also mentioned by Thomas. Sub-Saharan Africa has taken over from the Levant as the epicenter of violent extremism. The region accounted for 48% of terrorist attacks in 2021 alone. Initiatives such as the Africa Group of the Global Coalition Against Daesh reflect this changing reality. We cannot expect African governments to fight alone. We must continue our collective support while taking into account the regional and local contexts of violent extremism in Sub-Sahara, but also in East Africa. This shift poses a dilemma for us as policymakers in the West. How do we ensure that we continue to devote the necessary resources, being it financial or human and technological, to a phenomenon that is increasingly regarded as a diminishing threat, at least in the Western societies? I'm here today to emphasize that terrorism is certainly not an issue of the past, including in the Western world. And at the same time, I'm also here to make a case, perhaps for a different approach to our CT interventions, adapting to changing world and a different kind of violent extremism that we have dealt with in the previous years. As I said also, the topic of today's seminar is very timely. The terrorist threat of 2022 is more diffuse and complex than it was in 2001. Still, this reality is not always reflected in our responses to today's threats. This also implies to our concept of terrorism itself. Many still equate terrorism with Islamic terrorism. This goes for media and public opinion, but also actually for policymakers. At the same time, we see a variety of definitions being applied to a phenomena such as right-wing extremism, as also discussed during the previous session. Besides the obvious polarizing effects of this one-sided approach, focusing heavily on Islamic terrorism while ignoring other forms of terrorism such as right-wing extremism, anti-government extremism, and left-wing extremism and terrorism, it also means that we are all ill-equipped to deal with these types of extremism and violence. It is good to note that this is slowly changing, though, with an increasing amount of attention and resources being devoted to other forms of violent extremism and terrorism, foremost to right-wing extremism and terrorism, and especially in the Netherlands, to accelerationism. But we still have ways to go, both in terms of policy and in public debate. So to kick off, allow me to put forward a few observations and pose a few questions which I believe can be of vital importance for our CT efforts. And I hope that it can help the discussions that we will have later on. The first observation I would like to share with you is the increased importance of both the global and the local spheres and the interplay between both. This in itself is nothing new. However, I do believe that today's increasingly polarized world poses new and complex challenges in the fight against global terrorism. Allow me to elaborate. The successes that we as the international community have achieved in our fight against terrorism are due largely because of the international consensus about the need and the ways to combat terrorism and its perpetrators. In simplistic terms, it means we all agreed that fighting global terrorism was more pressing than fighting each other, and we did so rather successfully. There are many examples of continued successful international cooperation on CT. There's strong cooperation within the EU, within the Global Coalition Against Daesh, the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, the NATO, just to name a few. The Netherlands plays an active role in all these alliances. However, it's safe to say that global consensus on CT is under significant pressure. Global power dynamics are more polarized than they have been in decades. And there has been extensive writing about a resurgence of Cold War between US and Russia. The same goes for systemic changes due to the rise of China, as we discussed also already, and as was also raised by Thomas. In our view, more attention should be given to what these global shifts mean for our CT efforts, both globally and on the ground. The effects have been detrimental. Within the UN system, reaching consensus about CT strategies has become increasingly difficult, and previously agreed language is no longer a given. This is most pronounced in the discussions about the human rights within CT. As a direct result, I foresee challenging discussions on the upcoming revision of the global counter-terrorism strategy, for example, that will take place soon. More worrying, global power dynamics directly also impact our efforts on the ground. Mali is an obvious example, with Wagner Group effectively replacing an international Western coalition at the invitation of the local government. The developments in Mali underscore the need for change in our policies. A changing global order requires changing our approach to CT as well. This brings me to the local sphere. Locally and regionally, multilateral and regional partnerships remain of crucial importance. The G5 Sahel and Global Coalition's important work in the Sahel are two excellent examples of this. However, shifting dynamics globally means that strengthening local ownership of CT interventions has become all the important. This is not without risk, obviously. Local actors might choose interventions or partnerships that are contrary to our CT values. Again, the developments in Mali come in mind. In today's world, we can no longer assume partner governments will embrace the Western or European views on CT. We will have to work harder to convince local actors and populations that our ways do work. In February of this year, the Netherlands co-hosted an international conference on spillover of violent extremism in West Africa. One of the key points put forward by the many African participants was that only the affected countries themselves can bring about lasting change. And of course, the international community has an important role to play, but it's the local actors themselves that should be in the lead. This is not a new conclusion, and I'm sure many of us would support the notion of locally led solutions. But it is not that simple, and a truly locally led approach requires an adaptation in our multilateral way of doing things. Traditional coalitions will have to be broadened to include not only state actors, but regional and local elites, civil society organizations, and grassroots representatives as well. And as mentioned before, there's an increasing risk that local partners choose approaches that do not align with our policies or interests. The risk becomes even more acute in this time of new great power competition in some of the most fragile regions in the world. There are countless examples of China and Russia and others actively expanding their reach into Africa, but also Latin America and Central Asia. And the changing world order thus forces us to adopt more flexible approaches, and we'll have to explore broader and more non-traditional partnerships if we want to counter the narrative coming from violent extremist groups as well as from competing state actors. And this is not necessarily a negative development. We see it as an opportunity to build stronger and more inclusive civil society networks in fragile regions. This in turn will facilitate our work towards strengthening human rights and the role of CSOs in counterterrorism. This brings me to the central topic of today's conference and what coincides also with the Dutch approach to the CT. Although I realize that many of you probably know and are familiar with the Dutch policies on CT, allow me to briefly elaborate on two key elements. Namely, the first one being the importance of human rights in counterterrorism and the safeguarding of civic space within the counterterrorism debate. Both human rights and the participation of civic organizations are under severe pressure globally. There are many examples of gross human rights violations and repression of civil society committed under the name of security. The long-running war in Syria, for example, the conflict in Ukraine and the situation in Xinjiang are a few examples. Within the UN system, the focus on human rights in CT is increasingly being framed by some as matters of the West versus the rest. This is not only untrue, but it's very short-sighted. The Dutch government believes that CT policy without a comprehensive human rights approach is doomed to fail. We actively advocate this view in our bilateral, regional, and multilateral interventions. And in order to safeguard human rights in CT, we must enable meaningful participation of civil society, both in global agenda setting and in local policy making. An example is how the Netherlands is working on this together with Morocco, has worked on this together with Morocco, where we were the driving force behind the GCTF initiative and the resulting guidelines on ensuring the implementation of countering the financing of terrorism while safeguarding civic space. That's the name of the guidelines that we published together with Morocco, or facilitated the publication of it. In this regard, we wholeheartedly support the recommendation of Securing the Future initiative, which in its elevation of 20 years of CT policy of UN Security Council states that we should maintain the global consensus that terrorism is best addressed through a whole of society approach that respects human rights and is underpinned by international cooperation. And I'm very pleased that Noreen is here today to hopefully share some more on the most important outcomes of the SFI evaluation. Our Dutch network of 12 regional and bilateral security coordinators worldwide is instrumental to this Dutch approach. This network not only serves as our eyes and ears in some of the most fragile and complex regions, but it also gives a human face to our efforts on the ground. This is extremely valuable. For example, as part of the Dutch-sponsored program on rehabilitation and reintegration on foreign terrorist fighters in Bosnia and Herzegovina, our regional security coordinator for the Western Balkans actively worked with academia and civil society in support of Bosnia and Herzegovina to develop their own reintegration and rehabilitation strategies. It's very gratifying to see that his and our collective efforts are paying off, as human rights in CT, prevention, and the whole of society approach are now adopted in the recently updated CT and CVE strategies of 6 Western Balkan countries. This is only one of the many examples of the added value that our network of regional security coordinators bring. And I must emphasize, this network is not a static entity. Just as violent extremists continuously adopt their tactics to cause maximum damage, we too must maintain the flexibility to adapt our strategies for maximum impact. This means that we regularly evaluate our network to determine whether we are still in the right place and engaging with the right counterparts. An outcome of one such evaluation was the shift in focus from Sahel to the West African coastal states and the stationing of a regional security coordinator now in Ghana, Accra. This shift does not imply a lack of interest in the extremely worrying developments in the Sahel. It rather shows that limited resources and our expertise on prevention should be used in a different way. Now, let me touch on something that I stated at the start of the remarks made, namely the fact that terrorism is still too often conflated with Islamic terrorism. I'm happy to say that at least in the CT community, there's a growing realization that right and left-wing violent extremism and terrorism, as well as other forms of ideologically motivated violent extremism and terrorism, merits our urgent attention. In this light, I must also mention anti-governmental violent extremism as a particularly worrying phenomenon. We realize that many governments, including our own, still struggle with the most adequate way to combat these relatively new threats. This is partly due to the lack of physical organizational structures of right-wing violent extremism, but also our governments struggle to keep up with the changing use of the online domain and the use of new technologies such as cyber terrorism. According to the Global Terrorism Index, acts of religious terrorism in the West declined by 82% in the past 3 years. These have now been overtaken by politically motivated right and left-wing violent extremism. This now accounts for 5 times as many attacks as religious terrorism. While it is important to note that this includes both left and right-wing extremism, the rise in right-wing extremism and terrorism, in particular accelerationism, has been most notable. And this is fueled by greater polarization and, again, the changing global power structures. The influence of Russia and certain right-wing extremism and ethno-nationalist groups, in particular in the Western Balkans, but also in other countries, is an example of this development. And of course, the war in Ukraine has only fueled this and has exacerbated existing tensions in regional relations in the Western Balkans. This linkage between right-wing extremism and global politics that we are witnessing in this region is acutely worrying, firstly for the communities that are affected, but also because of the potential for regional destabilization and spillover to the neighboring countries. I'm grateful for the leadership of some partner countries on right-wing extremism and terrorism, in particular the US, Germany, but also Canada and Australia. And we in the Netherlands have also scaled up our efforts in combating this phenomena. Our national counter-terrorism strategy puts greater focus on the online domain, as well as on potentially violent lone actors, which can be linked to accelerationist movements. Across the border, most notably in the Western Balkans, we work closely with local governments, policymakers, and practitioners to identify and prevent root causes of radicalization. I think I'll close slowly. I was looking at the time. In closing, I would like to thank ICCT first for your valuable work. And as I've argued, CT policies and practices cannot and should not be the same as they were in the years after the attacks of 9/11, or even during the existence of physical IS caliphate in Syria and Iraq. The ICCT provides us with evidence-based research and policy recommendations that help us evaluate our policies and help determine whether they are truly fit for purpose. In today's world of shifting power dynamics, this is invaluable. As I said, the topic of today's seminar is both important and timely, and I look very much forward to exchanging views with you in ways to find out how CT policies can remain effective and inclusive. Thank you very much, and wishing you a very fruitful rest of the day and tomorrow, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. My name is Alexander von Rosenbach. I am the business manager here at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, and I'm going to make an unscheduled, although a brief intervention here as basically ICCT's one-man hype squad for a couple of minutes. My mandate from Thomas was to shine a light on some of the work that ICCT has been doing. A lot of you know and are connected to us through our research. There's a lot that goes on here that goes beyond research, that connects research to other parts of the world, other parts of the job of CT and PCVE prevention. And I want to show you a little bit of that. But I wanted to start with a bit of a question to the room. My job is also to introduce a few new things today, and I wonder if anyone has yet figured out what is new about this slide. Folks may know us well. Alistair in particular might well know us. Indeed, we have a new logo that we are launching today. It is part of our general effort to extra points for you, Alistair. Part of our effort to turn over a new leaf. As many of you know, we've been an institution around for over 12 years. But last year we made an important governance change. We also brought Thomas on board, and importantly, we drafted a new 5-year multi-annual strategy. And as part of that effort, we decided it was the right moment to then also rebrand a little bit and put a new image out there into the world. I'm going to see if this works. Which way do I need to point? This way. Ooh, it's over here. Okay. So the logo is not the only thing that's changing. What you will also see if you keep an eye on our website over the next weeks is a new and fully updated website. We have spent a lot of time, and particularly the communications team has spent a lot of effort trying to refresh the page to firstly make it a bit cleaner, more modern, which is great, but more importantly to really start to better showcase our thematic expertise, our geographic expertise, so that we can help surface the right kind of content quickly. And to that effect, we've also gone a bit further by looking at how we talk about the kind of work that we produce, particularly research. So we've now got reclassified into long reads, policy reads, and short reads with an eye to understanding that different audiences come to us with different time and different levels of experience and knowledge. So trying to help classify content a little bit better. And also we've significantly overhauled our filtering system, very exciting. But the idea being basically to try and get you the right content quickly and effectively to make the most of your contact with us online. The last thing we've changed on the website, and perhaps maybe the most important thing that we have done here, is to resurface all of that is beyond the research portal. If you look at our website right now, if you look at our traffic online, we are heavily focused on people engaging with our research profile, which is great, but ICCT does a ton more, as I said, than just research. In fact, if you look at how our staff spend their time, the majority of that time is spent connecting research into practice or connecting research into policy frameworks and environments. And we do that not only here in the Netherlands, as you've heard, with the NCTV as well as the MFA, but also in the European context and in many, many other parts of the world, in the Sahel, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and the like. And what we want to do with this website is to really showcase not only where we work, but the kinds of things that we offer to the world. And here you can just see a little bit of a snapshot of that. But I will take you a little bit further into that to just give you a couple examples of what it looks like to be working at ICCT and the kind of impact that we really pride ourselves on as an entity. So I'll start here, which is on a project that ICCT has been working on for some time. We've been working in and on Iraqi security challenges for several years, and has been specifically focused on supporting the international community and the government of Iraq with the challenges related to repatriation of Iraqi nationals from northeast Syria. And in the last year in particular, we've been very grateful to work closely with IOM on a series of roundtables in Erbil and in Baghdad that culminated in high-level public commitment by the Iraqi government, supported by a range of UN and other stakeholders, to repatriate over 30,000 Iraqi women and children from northeast Syria in the coming years. That itself, considering the context of what we deal with here in Europe and the scale of what Iraq is dealing with, is quite an open and we think admirable commitment to make, but we need to go further with that work beyond just the public commitments. And now we are working very directly with IOM and other partners who want to turn that into practice, to put that into practice. So specifically, our work focuses on prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of those returnees. So bringing together the more legal human rights, rule of law components, but also the PCVE component of that. And we've also been working in complement to that in Iraq, focused on strengthening Iraqi civil society organizations who are on the front lines of PCVE interventions, recognizing indeed, as we've heard now already several times, the importance of engaging and supporting and in fact putting in the lead local actors who really understand that context better than any of us can do from here in The Hague. There's a lot more to say about our work in Iraq now and where we're going with it. So if you find someone with a PCVE name tag, now I'm looking at Julie over here in the front row, and you want to know a little bit more about what we're up to, please come find her afterwards in the drinks. Coming a bit closer to home, I wanted to show you a second project that I think is really important, impactful, and vital to our work here, which is ICCT's support for the EU's, the European Commission's, Radicalization Awareness Network, and specifically their policy support project. RANPS, as it's called, aims to bridge the gap between policymaking, research, and that's in fact exactly aligned with our mission. So it is a project that is very close to our hearts. But we also then work more specifically to support EU member states on a range of topics and themes vital to implementing the EUCT agenda. ICCT's share of that focuses on a couple of core themes, indeed the management of returnees from Iraq and Syria, risk assessment in prisons, and a broader challenge around the prison exit nexus. Strategic communications is also a really important part of that work, and increasingly led by Tin Van Dongen, who's over here, focus on conspiracy theories, disinformation, misinformation, and the mainstreaming of radical discourses, which, as we know, is increasingly challenging here and in many other parts of Europe. The last thing I'll say about this project is that we also have a very important role as one of the team that is doing the monitoring and evaluation of the RAN more generally, and that is speaking directly to our commitment to understand not only what is a substantive contribution, so the events, the papers, but how does that actually translate into policy? What is the impact of what is, in the neighborhood of $30 million of EU public funding? How do we make better policy as a result of RAN policy support events and expertise? And we think that is a really important contribution, and I'm really happy to be part of that. And I'm going to come back to monitoring and evaluation in a couple minutes. But I wanted to show you one more project before we go too much further, which is the Foreign Terrorist Fighter Knowledge Hub. The FTF Knowledge Hub is a labor of love, we'll say. Now I'm looking at Christoph. I don't know where you are, but there you are. It's conceptualized jointly by ICCT and the TMC Osler Institute just down the road, who are a core founding partner of ICCT. And it was conceptualized basically to address a problem within the research field, which is that we understood as researchers working on returnees, the difficulty of finding high quality data on this, finding reliable data, finding up-to-date data about when people were coming back, where they were coming back to, and why certain choices were made in the policy environment and others not. National legislation, international standards are very hard to digest and understand, so we wanted to make that accessible first and foremost for our own selves, but also recognizing that there's a need there to make that more accessible for a broader public. So we've created the Knowledge Hub, which I will maybe breeze through briefly, contains key data. It contains indeed what we call a policy matrix to help understand the different kinds of policies that apply to returnees in different sort of spheres. And it also includes a library of dedicated resources, we think curated the best resources that are useful to help inform policy, but also general public debate about this issue. Tomorrow in the plenary, in a similar sort of intervention, one of the lead researchers, Sophia Baumann, will give a longer presentation about the hub, and not this hub, but that hub. Yeah, so if this is at all interesting to you, please come back in and join us tomorrow for that session, where you will be able to see a little bit more of how this is visually led, how it's interactive, and how it hopefully is useful to a wide range of audiences. So my final task is to give you an idea of where ICCT is headed as an organization over the next 5 years. As I said, we this year redrafted our 5-year annual, multi-annual, why do I keep saying annual? I'm not sure, multi-annual strategy. And I want to share a little bit about where what sort of big flags we're planting in that document, because you will all be part of that journey that we go through, and indeed will help ICCT be successful in various ways that you contribute to our community. As this slide says, I think the document is very clear. Our ambition is very clear. By 2027, ICCT will be the leading European-based think tank on CT and PCVE. We do not think we can do this alone. We know that there are many minds that need to be working together to crack the challenges that we work on every day. But we feel, as given our track record, given our relationships with European donors, with the international community based here in Europe, that we are the right institution to be the first port of call for project work, for research. We have an amazing set of expertise with focuses not only on Europe, but as I said earlier, on the global community's challenges. So we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't really try to get there as that preferred partner for Europe in the years ahead. To do that, we need to do a few things well. So we will continue, oh, we went all 3 of them, great. No surprises then anymore. We will continue to do cutting edge research. That is indeed the lifeblood of ICCT. We believe that all policy, all practice should be evidence-based in its core and fundamentals, and we will continue to focus on that. But I do want to let you know that there are some changes, important changes coming to the way we do research, the way we publish, and the way we profile ourselves there. They will happen in 2023. I don't want to let too much out of the bag yet, but it is clear at this point that we will be moving ICCT even closer to the core of the academic community and the academic debate here, and we are very happy that that opportunity has materialized. So keep an eye on the research side of things. You will see more from us in that respect next year. Second side is policymaking. We continue to deliver policymaking at the local level here. We work even just down the road with the Hague municipality. We work at the national level, indeed with NCTV and other actors. And we also work regionally and internationally through direct policy advice, through drafting recommendations, and through contributing to the policy debate, being at the table in important meetings and in important settings. But we do go further than that. We also are working directly to shape the policy environment. And by that, I mean that we are contributing to the drafting of good practice documents. Minna already mentioned one. We have been working very closely over the last few years with GCTF and others who are really shaping what the international policy landscape looks like. And we will continue to do that, to be at the very cutting edge of what CT and PCB policy work looks like. And the last thing that we will continue to do but strengthen is working shoulder to shoulder with practitioners around the world who are the ones on the front line. Our work has historically focused on this. We deliver trainings, workshops, capacity building programs, etc. But we've done it in a more ad hoc way. We've done it quietly, to be honest with you. And we think now that there is a real need to consolidate that expertise. We see recurring challenges and recurring capacity gaps that we think we're well positioned to more structurally address. So our effort is going to be to consolidate and strengthen our training programs and to make them more visible and more accessible for a wider range of audiences. So more on training as well coming soon. The last thing that I wanted to leave you with is this idea of focus on impact. So ICCT, I know everyone well who works at the organization, and I know everyone gets out of bed with the belief that what they're going to do that day is going to have a positive impact on the PCVE and CT space. And I have a feeling that everyone in this room, and indeed everyone online, wakes up with that same feeling. But we also, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that not a lot, or not enough, maybe is a better way to describe it, work has been done over the last 2 decades to really measure and evaluate the impact of our work. Now, our work as a field more broadly. We know there's been mistakes made. Some of them are very visible, others are quiet and don't get noticed. But we believe there's a lot more to learn, and we can get, as a community, a lot better at our work if we take a careful look at not only what we do today, but how it is affecting the communities, the audiences that we engage with tomorrow, next year, and over the longer term. We believe that ICCT is also the right place to start making that vision a reality. We want to change the idea that it's hard to, we want to address the idea that it's hard to do impact and evaluation work in PCV and CT. We know it is. We know it's difficult to prove a negative. We know it's hard to get into these places to do real on-the-ground evaluation work. But we also believe that if we put our minds together as an institution, as like-minded community, that we can address some of these challenges and we can get better at measuring impact. We've already started down this journey, and we are going to continue to invest more and more in this field in the coming years. And I will close by asking you today to do a small bit yourself. Events like this are, of course, fun to organize. Glad you're here to join us. But we also organize these events to make sure that, with the hope that you will, as an audience member, whether online or here in the room, take away something that helps improve your work, that makes it possible for you to go a little bit further with your own priorities. And we therefore have, I'm trying to think about where it is, in the agenda, I believe, on your desk, and also for those who are following online, there'll be a post-event survey. Exactly, there's a QR code here. If you scan that today at the end of this session and give us it's 5 questions, it's a minute of your time. If you give us a little bit of insight into what went well today, what you could take away from this, and also things you wish were discussed, ideas that you wish we would have gone to, that will help us make this event and future events like it even better. You've probably already spent 90 minutes or 2 hours with us. Give us 1 more minute, and we'll be able to make next year's event even more interesting for you. I will leave the microphone here for Thomas and the panelists to come up. Thomas, are you giving housekeeping about the question and answer? Do you want me to do that as well? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. I hope this has shed a little bit of more light on what we do here, but we'd love to find you and answer any more questions that we have this afternoon, tomorrow. Follow us up anytime. We're here all the time. So thanks for your...
Thanks a lot, Alex. And as you fill the survey, there's a little questionnaire, of course, to see how attentive you were, to ask you what the new features of the website are. But indeed, it would be great if you can fill this survey. Thanks a lot, Alex, for presenting all these great achievements of ICCT. Now that we have thrown a lot of glitter on ourselves, we can also share some of the light with 2 brilliant panelists that are here with us today to discuss in more depth the potential impact of the evolution of global politics on the counterterrorism agenda. So I'm very privileged and very happy to share this panel with Noreen and with Mark. Noreen Fink is the Executive Director of the Soufan Center, a US-based organization, and a Senior Advisor at the International Peace Institute. Previously, she was a Senior Policy Advisor on Counter-Terrorism and Sanctions at the United Kingdom's mission to the United Nations. She also worked with UN Women, the UN Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, and the Global Center on Cooperative Security. I should know that one. She has developed and implemented CT and CVE projects across the globe in regions as diverse as West Africa and South Asia, and published widely on counterterrorism, gender, the UN, and de-radicalization efforts. Welcome, Noreen. Thanks for being with us. I'm also privileged to have Mark Hecker, who is the Director of Research and Communications at the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, France's main think tank on foreign and security policy, as well as Editor-in-Chief of Politique Étrangère, IFRI's academic journal. He's also a research fellow at the Security Studies Center and holds a PhD in political science from Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne and teaches a course on terrorism at Sciences Po Paris. He has published many articles on terrorism and counterterrorism, as well as several books, including most recently La Guerre de 20 ans, the 20 wars, the 20 years war. Is it going to be translated in English? Not yet, hopefully. Not yet. Okay, if anyone is interested, I strongly recommend that book that is published only in French so far. That book has received multiple awards and is a remarkable summary of the past 20 years of counterterrorism efforts. A few house rules before we start. I will lead a conversation with our panelists, but then we will later open the floor for questions. There are people with us here in the room, but there's also many more people attending online. So for those online, we're not forgetting you. We don't see you here in the panel, but we know that you are there. So you can ask questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. We will try, there's people from ICCT's team looking at it, and we will try to invite some of you to ask your questions directly if technique allows. Otherwise, we have someone here that can ask the question out loud on your behalf to the speakers. And finally, final point, if you're tweeting, please remember to use the conference hashtag, which is somewhere on the slides behind me, or if you're online, probably showing on your screen. So Mark, I'm starting with you. Over the past year, Western forces have withdrawn from several counterterrorism theaters that had been major priorities over the past decade or two, mainly from Afghanistan and the Sahel. Meanwhile, the future of the global coalition in Syria is quite uncertain. These withdrawals have legitimately raised questions about what many years of counterterrorism efforts have been able to achieve or not achieve, and what will happen next. That is, in a sense, basically the question of success. But beyond that question, one can also ask whether this is not actually the sign that we have reached the end of an era in counterterrorism. From the US perspective, for instance, it is clear that a shift has been operated in counterterrorism strategic planning. As the latest national security strategy has it, the US will shift from a strategy that is US-led, partner-enabled to one that is partner-led, US-enabled. Sorry, it's very hard to say, but that's the US new wording. How would you describe the current evolution of counterterrorism policy, particularly in light of the major geopolitical evolutions ongoing that have been described by Nina before, and what do you expect to change compared with the past 20 years?
Well, thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you, Thomas, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to keep the future for the rest of the conversation and focus on the past 20 years. And you're right, I mean, it's the change of an era. To put it very simplistically, we had a 20-year strategic cycle, the global war on terror, that started in 2001 with 9/11, and that ended in the summer of 2021 with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And now there's a new strategic cycle. We can call it strategic competition or great power competition, but it's something different. But of course, terrorist threats have not disappeared. So one of the questions will be how can we continue to focus on this threat? Well, the strategic priorities have clearly changed. And you mentioned the recent national security strategy of the US. CT is present in this strategy, but it's really down the list. Basically, the main focus is China, then you have Russia, and then you have a second category of shared challenges. And among these shared challenges, CT is really down the list. So you have climate change first, you have health issues, you have non-proliferation, food insecurity, and then terrorism. So first, what I'm going to do is to go back on this 20-year period. I will not sum up the 20 years war because it's not the objective here today. But what I'm going to do is to take the 5 subdivisions, the 5 sub-periods that we identified in this book, and to try and make a few hints to Russia, China, and also the second important topic of this conference, that is to say human rights. So the first period basically was from 2001 to 2006. That's the aftermath of 9/11, the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, and then the war in Iraq. And what's interesting with China first is that actually China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. And you have more and more narrative in the US saying basically that this 20-year period was diversion for the US, while China did not focus almost at all on CT, but focused on its development, on its economic development, and became actually one of the 2 superpowers with a very impressive economic development in 2 decades. The second important actor is Russia, and Russia actually used the rhetoric of the global war on terror as a positive element for the country, meaning that Russia at the time was still involved in the war in Chechnya, was perceived very badly by the international community as perpetrating a massive human rights violation. And suddenly after 9/11, Russia tried to, in a way, get included in this global war on terror rhetoric, trying to explain that basically we had the same enemies. We were all fighting Islamic terrorism. And of course, we tried to differentiate the situations, explaining that Chechnya was something different and that there are different types of practices in CT. But the fact is that for Russia, the kind of cities that it was doing became kind of more acceptable. It's perhaps a bit too blunt to say it that way, but there were far less criticism after 9/11 than before. And also what we realized very quickly in this first period from 2001 to 2006 was that it was actually pretty difficult to cope CT and human rights, even for the US. I mean, just think about what happened during the few years of the global war on terror. You had Guantanamo, you had the Patriot Act, you had Abu Ghraib, you had the black sites of the CIA, the judicial debates about the difference between enhanced interrogation techniques and torture. You had a normalization, standardization of targeted killings. So suddenly, I think we realized also in the West that it's pretty difficult to have a very, very high standard of human rights when you deal with CT, even though we try to continue to defend this approach. It's a reality that it's difficult. Then there's the second period. The second period goes from 2006 to 2011, and that's the so-called COIN era, the counterinsurgency era, that started with the surge in Iraq. The surge worked pretty well in Iraq. The situation went from an open civil war to a situation that was pretty much stabilized. And you also had in 2008 the financial crisis. And I think that from this moment, it was clear in the US that the political leaders at the time already wanted to close this strategic cycle. They thought that these wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan were expensive financially, expensive in terms of human resources, and there were already other priorities domestically with the financial crisis, the industrial crisis, but also externally. And already at the end of this period, you have the idea of the pivot to Asia that rose in the US. But actually, this pivot to Asia could not take place at the time because the third period started. And the third period started in 2011 with the Arab Spring. 2011, it's also the death of bin Laden, of course. And with the Arab Spring, there was at the time a rise of Islamist movement in the Arab world, Ansar al-Sharia, for instance, in Tunisia, and jihadist movement in Syria with Jabhat al-Nusra, for instance, and later ISIS. It's also during this period that the operation in Libya took place with mainly France, the UK, the US. And it's also during this period in 2013 that the French operation in Mali began. And I think Libya is important because it was the beginning of a rift, I think, with Russia and China, because the operation was authorized, as you know, in the UN. But the Russians especially perceived that there was an overreach, an overextension of the mandate. Basically, to say it a bit simplistically, what they had in mind was the concept of responsibility to protect, and they ended up with regime change. Then you have the fourth period from 2014 to 2017 with the creation of the caliphate, the so-called caliphate, the expansion of ISIS and its external operations. And I want to remind that at the time, Russia was also against ISIS. And in a way, we had the same enemy. I want to remind, for instance, that in 2015, a Russian civilian plane was shot down, was actually exploded in the Sinai Peninsula, killing more than 200 people, and that the Russians really perceived that ISIS was their enemy. But of course, we had the same enemy, but we did not fight this enemy together. Russia was not included, was not involved in the global coalition against ISIS. So here, I think an important lesson is that you can have the same enemy, but it does not necessarily mean that you share the same values, that you share the same practices, and that you're part of the same coalition. Last period, because I'm being too long, 2017 to 2021, we call this period in the book The Strange Victory, a reference to The Strange Defeat, a book written by Marc Bloch, the famous French historian. Strange victory because some leaders declared victory against ISIS, but obviously the threats are still here. So ISIS lost its sanctuaries, its territories, but the threat has evolved, and the ideology plus the human resources plus the weapons are still present. And I think that we've seen two important elements developing over the past years. First, strategic fatigue, and it's true for the US, it's true for the West in general, it's true for France also in the Sahel, even though France actually did not withdraw from the Sahel, it withdrew only from Mali and redeployed in the region. And the second important point is new priorities that are linked to adversaries like China or Russia, and new priorities that are linked to other elements like the COVID crisis. So health issues suddenly have become even more important than terrorism, even if you look at a document like the National Security Strategy that you mentioned before. And we could also add other issues like climate change and so on. And so we're back to the beginning of the conversation. Terrorism and CT is now really down the list.
Thank you very much, Mark. Noreen, turning to you, last month, an attempt to trigger a discussion at the Human Rights Council on the alleged repression of the Uyghur population by the Chinese authorities in the Xinjiang region was successfully blocked by China, presumably as a result of Beijing's diplomacy and its broad network of partner countries that has been built over the years. And probably also as a result of China's growing economic and political influence. Now, this was a very particular case, obviously, but also to some extent, maybe one illustrative of some of the broader trends that are going on. Noreen, you've been working in or around UN institutions for many years. How would you say that the discussions on counterterrorism have evolved over the years at the UN level? Do you feel that great powers rivalry is increasingly impacting on CT discussions? And if so, how exactly and with what consequences?
Thanks, Thomas. Loud enough? Thanks, Thomas, to you and the ICC team for the invitation and getting right into your very easy question to answer. I think in large part, it's important to remember that the UN is itself, constituted of its member states. And so in many ways, what happens at the UN has always been shaped by the behaviors and priorities of its member states. And I think that while we are looking now at a sort of greater fragmentation in the relationship between the permanent members, certainly the CT agenda as we know it and talked about it, and as Mark has described, was in fact shaped, in large part by the permanent members. So, certainly led by the US in 2001. So what I think was actually remarkable about counterterrorism at the UN was great power consensus, right? And it's, I think, the only topic we have seen on the Security Council agenda that had unparalleled consensus for 20 years until 2020. And I think that is that's a very important thing to remember. It meant that the CT agenda has been rather exceptionalized for 2 decades. So it has been largely by design and in practice insulated from the rest of the UN's work on peace and security, on armed conflict, on human rights, and we'll talk about some of those implications. So I think that consensus in many ways has shaped what we talk about in terms of the global CT agenda insofar as it existed on paper and in policy aspiration. I should add here that while we talk about great power rivalry and we talk about the permanent members in the council, it is also that these, 2 decades have been shaped by about 100 non-permanent members that have come through the council, including the Netherlands and many other states that have helped shape and in many ways kind of add a very important sculpting touch to the counterterrorism agenda. So when we think of things like gender, human trafficking, sexual violence, PCVE, a lot of these issues have been championed also by non-permanent members in the council. And so that's important to remember. So for 2 decades, CT was seen as a safe space in the Security Council. Despite the wars in Iraq, Syria, everywhere, we could agree we had the same enemy. And I think what is going to shift now is that predictable success that you could kind of count on in the Security Council, that consensus is gone. And that is quite remarkable, I think, given what it did withstand over the last 2 decades. What the implication of that is the very carefully balanced global frameworks that we developed in terms of resolution language, checks and balances, language on human rights, which, as Mark has described, was not an early priority, but certainly came into the CT agenda. All of that, I would say, is, to put it, it's up for grabs, right? Whether there's a causal relationship between some of the degradation of human rights protections and Security Council mechanisms, that's up for debate. What it has done is create an enabling space for the use and misuse of CT legislation to go after dissidents and human rights defenders and things like that. And the problem is there's no way to hold them accountable in the council. The council is, of course, a difficult place to call out other permanent members. And so I think that's going to be a major implication of the, if we were going to future cast the implication of great power rivalry, is that the council will become less of a comfortable space for CT. It doesn't mean the UN is not a space for it. You talked about the Human Rights Council. Certainly China and the challenges in Xinjiang have been mentioned in other parts of the UN system. But I don't think we'll see that comfortable sort of agreement and that consensus on counterterrorism.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Noreen. Maybe just a follow-up question. I mean, there will be soon enough a discussion on the global counterterrorism strategy again. Some thoughts maybe about how this is going to play out in that context?
Many thoughts. How long do we have? I think that if, in 2018 and 2020, there were very difficult challenges in the review of the global strategy in terms of putting in language on prevention and human rights and gender, and then defending what was already there. Even the victories we thought we had were seemingly quite fragile. If it was difficult then, I imagine that this time it will become nearly impossible. I think there might be a push for some kind of technical rollover, if that's, feasible. But I think the challenge will be how to defend what's in there, and more importantly, make sure that the good language that's in there becomes a basis for action continually at the UN. The challenge with the strategy is you can sometimes win rhetorical victories and then, the implementation becomes challenging. So I think this time round, there will be less, the gloves will have come off. There will be less of a consensus to build on. And I think if sort of like-minded groups are not incredibly proactive and willing to go out on a limb, I think we will have a real challenge. They're keeping what was there.
And that's the thing, right? I mean, the gloves are off, as you say. So increasingly, we feel that those countries that we used to call emerging powers are established powers now, and they're increasingly assertive in multilateral forums, such as the UN, but also in bilateral relations. They don't want to be lectured by the West anymore. I'm turning to you, Mark. In fact, they contest the universality of many Western norms and values, and actually know very well their strength and leverages. And for anyone who's attended UN conversation, I mean, sometimes their rhetoric is quite strong and quite. They know where to put their finger, and actually, sometimes it feels. Reading European leaders or diplomats' statement in response to severe violations of human rights in the counterterrorism context by some of these states, one is struck by a language that could appear sometimes as too soft or too compromising, at least for those of us not working in diplomacy. So my question to you, Mark, is what can we do? What can Europe and its member states do in these multilateral forums or in bilateral relation with these countries to condemn abuse and bring change without breaking the relationship? Because obviously breaking the relationship wouldn't be constructive. So as the EU ambassador to China wrote recently, trust and understanding are turning into rare commodities these days. But nonetheless, what can we do, Mark?
Well, I think that our leverage is really limited. There are two basic principles of international relations that are put under tension here. The first one is the concept of sovereignty. So basically, China and Russia are keen on insisting on the importance of this concept of sovereignty. So it doesn't mean that a country can I will not refer to multilateral forum, but to the recent visit of Olaf Scholz to China. I mean, he really paid lip service to human rights. He said something, but then, I mean, everyone clearly understood that, the Chinese economy is so important for Germany, especially during the context of the energy crisis and so on, that it's very hard to actually just, close the market, the Chinese market. And if you look at the composition of the delegation with the CEOs of these important German industries, you just understand that, yes, that there are trade-offs. And in this case, the economy is perceived perhaps as more important as other issues. So it's sad, but some would say it's realpolitik. I don't know if it's realpolitik, but it's actually the current state of international affairs. What else can we say about multilateral organization and human rights? Well, multilateral organizations have their limits, it's obvious. And you mentioned the Security Council. Well, there's the veto power, and Russia and China have a veto power. So just saying that, you understand that there's an obvious limit to the system. Plus, China is investing quite a lot on the multilateral system, trying to put high-level civil servants in different UN organizations and doing that pretty well. Plus, there's been a certain complacency toward UN organizations by Western countries, including the US during the Trump administration. What else? If you think about the war in Ukraine, well, one of the most important organizations dealing with human rights in Europe is the Council of Europe. And when you have a real problem with one member, what do? You exclude the member. And Russia, at the same time, almost decided to leave the organization and to leave the European Court of Human Rights at the same time. So exclusion will not actually solve the problem. It will just be a matter of decoupling. And I think that we're heading towards a more decoupled world, except perhaps in the realm of economic relations, because we have such an important interdependence.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And this is certainly a topic that we will continue discussing tomorrow in the second plenary session, the impact on the human rights-driven agenda. Maybe moving, well, still following that train of thoughts, but moving slightly, at least geographically. Last September, the leaders of the countries belonging to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met in person for the first time since the pandemic. And for those not familiar, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a China-led security organization covering notably counterterrorism cooperation in Central Asia and South Asia, but obviously on Chinese terms. The SCO summit was actually Xi Jinping's first trip outside of China since the pandemic, so quite a symbolic statement in that summit as well. And Xi's final remarks and the final communique of the SCO confirmed that counterterrorism is high on the agenda of the organization and clearly aligned with China's visions and priorities. Now, Noreen, to what extent is an organization like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization challenging the more traditional counterterrorism agenda, notably the one within the UN system? What can still be fixed within the existing multilateral system, acknowledging that great powers rivalry is probably not the only problem that is undermining the multilateral system? Can we revive some of these organizations, also thinking of others like GCTF or SC? Or do we need something new alongside the lines of Biden's League of Democracies sort of rhetoric? What can we do, Doreen?
That's cheating. That's about 10 questions that need about 10 sessions. You started with SCO. Let me try and organize a few thoughts. I'm a bit jet lagged, but I'll try. I think I'm glad you raised the SCO because you had asked if we are, still in an era of kind of global cooperation, right? I think in some ways we are moving away from kind of global counterterrorism cooperation on some level and going into this more bifurcated or multipolar areas of cooperation. And I think it's important to remember that organizations like the SCO, sometimes the CSTO, and others like OSCE, everyone's doing CT in a slightly different way. And I think that's a challenge to think about. It's not the first time it's not, it's diverged from the UN. They are an observer state in the GA. The resolution that recognizes their observer status, in fact, fixes the SCO version of separatism, extremism, and terrorism, right? Which is the Chinese formulation. Which, if that came up in a GCTS, we would have said no. This is not an acceptable framing, but it's already, formalized into their observer status in the GA. Why am I getting into all this nitty-gritty technical stuff? Basically to highlight that these contradictions are already inherent in the system. So when you say traditional CT centered, in the UN, I'm not sure that that exists. I think everyone is doing their own version of CT. So I think that's part of a challenge. Do we need more entities doing CT? I'm very wary of that because, as Mark has highlighted, and we've seen, exclusion is not a great idea. People will do their own thing. We already have GCTF, we have OCT, we have CTED, we have a lot of mechanisms to do things. I think the real challenge is to actually do it. There are a lot of existing opportunities to hold states in some degree accountable. There are, CTED assessment visits for those of you who track the nitty-gritty of UN work. There's monitoring compliance, there are debates. States have a lot of creative space when they come into multilateral fora to shape the agenda. That's not happening a lot. So I don't think we need new fora. I don't think they'll work any better if they just continue fragmentation. You'll just get sort of like-minded groups doing smaller level CT that is regional, sub-regional. I think what's more important is that, the UN and others work in better partnerships so that the UN is working more with regional, sub-regional organizations, that there is sort of more connectivity between the entities that are there. And I think that for a lot of countries, that's where the resonance is. It's in the regional, sub-regional organizations. And it's important to take seriously the organizations we don't work with. Not a lot of people working on CT in the UN looked at the SCO's memorandum or look at what's happening at SCO meetings. But that's the kind of CT that is dominant in that space. And so I think we have to be very careful about assuming that we can afford to work without acknowledging them. I think that's a challenge. And I think, if sort of the 20 years after 9/11 were shaped kind of by the 9/11 agenda and what came after, the next 20 years will be shaped by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the relationships that has exposed. So I don't know that a new CT entity or league would actually get us any further. Did I address all of the questions?
Well, just to follow up, so UN should work more with regional entities. So UN should work more with SCO, for instance?
They already do. That's the challenge. Not challenge, but the reality is that the UN is a democratic space of 193 states, and the UN does, the CT architecture does work. Yeah, it's already working. CTED works with SCO, the OCT, the Office of Counter-Terrorism, works with the SCO. Again, SCO is an observer state, it has an observer status in the General Assembly. And they accompany many missions as a regional entity. So a lot of this cooperative work is already happening and has been happening. And rather than flag that as a concern, which I suspect some people may be thinking of, I think that also showcases a very real opportunity to build some working relationships and make sure that there is a channel of communication that's open. It's already there and it's already happening. I just think that there's not enough kind of investment in understanding it better.
Okay, thank you. Mark, since the beginning of this conference, we have focused on great powers rivalry, but there are many more pressing issues, obviously, on the global agenda, such as climate change, energy, pandemic, economy, you name it. And obviously, many of these issues are interlinked to some extent. Climate change can exacerbate the threat of terrorism. Economic downturn can nurture a certain nationalistic discourse, possibly resulting in violent extremism, etc. Now, every issue is seemingly increasingly pressing, complex, intricate, and our ability to address any of these issues is determined, at least in part, by the level of cooperation or non-cooperation among global powers. In this context, do you feel that counterterrorism is being downgraded on the list of priorities, particularly from a Western point of view? You've partly already addressed that, but if it is being downgraded, why and with what consequences?
It's not a feeling, it's a fact. It is downgraded. So what's the consequence? To be short, less focus on CT for sure, And we have to address different threats: domestic terrorism, far right, far left, anti-state, anti-elites, etc., jihadism still, etc. It means less focus, means probably a bit of complacency. It means less resources, less capacities, less capabilities, less intelligence as well. So basically, you can forget big military operations. It's definitely the end of the COIN era, the counterinsurgency era. No one will be willing to deploy thousands of soldiers in the Sahel or in Afghanistan or in Yemen or whatever. There's a risk, I think, of bureaucratic amnesia. If you look at the recent, the new version of the Field Manual 3.0 operations in the US, Afghanistan is not mentioned at all. I mean, the US just spent, I mean, it was the longest war in the modern history of the US, and it's not even mentioned in the field manual dedicated to operations. That's striking. And by the way, I reviewed your book from your PhD dissertation, and at the end I wrote that you would be a passeur de mémoire, a ferryman of memories. And I hope that's the way to counter this risk of bureaucratic amnesia, because I think it's real. I mean, we have to, in a way, keep the expertise. I hope that ICCT will not have funding problems and will be able to keep the expertise, because the threat is still here, and we have to still be able to understand it, understand the evolutions, and be able to counter this threat or these threats. Now, if you look, that was for the city part. Now, if you look at the threat, I mean, the threat obviously is far from over. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are still alive, evolving. And what's also a bit of a paradox, that if you look at the recent national security strategy in the US, 3 safe havens, sanctuaries are mentioned in this strategy: Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. And still, I mean, city is very downgraded in the same strategy. If you think about Afghanistan, Edmund Fitton Brown, who headed the expert committee of the UN on sanctions, described Afghanistan as another safe haven for Al-Qaeda, even though Zawahiri was killed there, which shows that in a way over the horizon can work, but up to a certain point only. And then you have all the other threats that I mentioned, plus in this context of great power rivalry, you have to take into account the possibility of a return of state-sponsored terrorism, whether it is led by Iran or Russia or perhaps China. And when I say return, it's actually not that accurate, because as you know, in Belgium, because there was a trial not that far away, and we know it in France as well, because the plot took place in France, there was an Iranian-backed terrorist plot that was foiled a couple of years ago, a bit more than a couple of years ago. I think it was 4 years ago. And so there was this trial in Belgium with a diplomat, actually, who was sentenced to 20 years in jail, right? So the return of state-sponsored terrorism must also be taken into consideration. And it will be my final word on this issue. We're speaking more and more of a revival of a Cold War between Russia and the US. I'm not sure it's the right intellectual and conceptual framework, but if it's the case, we have to remember that during the Cold War, there were a lot of proxies, a lot of terrorist groups that were supported in a way by the Soviet Union or countries linked to the Soviet Union. So if we'll see a return in a way of the Cold War, we might see as well this return of proxies and state-sponsored terrorism.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And indeed, terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism and proxy wars are certainly challenges that are looming around the corner, or probably actually not even looming around the corner. Indeed, as you said, we already confronted to that. I had some questions around that, and I'm pretty sure also there will be questions from the audience or from the people online around these themes. And because I want to leave some time for questions from the floor, maybe a last question to you, Noreen, from me before I open the floor to people here in the room or online. So please prepare your questions. A last question maybe to look at the other side, maybe Noreen, because we have focused so far mostly on the risks and the negative consequences of the new global politics and its impact on counterterrorism. But if we try to see, the other side, always look on the bright side. If we try to look at the glass half full rather than a half empty, but also try to be maybe a little bit more self-critical about what we have been able to achieve over the past 20 years in counterterrorism. It's not necessarily a big success story. What potential opportunities, if any, does the current geopolitical evolution offer to Europe, to the United States, both to reflect on our own counterterrorism experiences, but also possibly to improve it?
You always pack about 15 questions into one.
I tend to do that, I agree.
What have we achieved? I think success really depends on where you're sitting, right? What if you're sitting in New York City, maybe the absence of another 9/11 for 2 decades looks pretty successful. Yes, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and iterations of them still exist, but the so-called caliphate, the territorial caliphate, does not. So I think some of the fragmentation and evolution we're looking at could in some ways be attributed to kinds of successes we've had. We've forced more individual, low-tech I hate to say low casualty because I think one is too many, but we're not looking at mass casualty international attacks so far for 2 decades. I think, it's a dangerous way to frame success because at the same time, we know it's come at a tremendous cost in lives and rights and precedents. So I do caveat that. I understand what I'm saying, how it could sound, but I think it is important to remember that there are some successes in terms of keeping people safer that we have learned, including the need to invest in prevention, to learn from local communities. We've learned that prevention does not just happen where we fear an attack, but where some of the grievances that might generate it are. So in some ways, if you're forcing me to look at something optimistic, which I feel I'm being forced, I would say that we have learned a few things. Now, the bigger question is, as Mark pointed out, the bureaucratic amnesia and whether we actually learn from these lessons and integrate them into future action. That's where I'm, if I'm going to be self-critical or critical of the endeavor, I fear that we will not learn these lessons. And in about 2 years, someone will say, oh my gosh, there's an international terrorist group. Should we invest in prevention? Should we, what is something we should do? So I think that's the problem. And I understand from a government perspective and a policymaker perspective, you have limitations on resources, on budgets and political cycles, but that that bureaucratic inertia is not just in one country, it's on a sort of global level. And I think that's, the amnesia, but also inertia sometimes. I think that's going to be the challenge. What is an opportunity it presents? You're really pushing me into a corner to be positive at this time. It presents Europe and like-minded states an opportunity to sharply differentiate itself from the other view of counterterrorism. We've spent 2 decades talking about our values, making sure that international counterterrorism norms look balanced with human rights considerations and others. This is an opportunity to actually be accountable to those values that we've put forward, demonstrate that we invest in human rights protection, demonstrate that we invest in accountability, which you didn't ask me about that, but that's where we've been quite weak, I think, accountability for ISIS crimes. But I think that opportunity to more sharply define a European or Western approach in terms of the positives of it, that I think is important, not just for CT, but for the wider kind of, dare I say, battle for influence. I don't want to use the term hearts and minds, but I think, beyond the CT agenda, that's what we're going to be making the case for, is that vision of how to do security, how to put forward a vision of human security rather than, the harder edge. So I think that's an opportunity we mustn't miss.
I didn't want to corner you, but I realized I did to some extent. Yes, thanks for trying to indeed answer my question. Nonetheless, Noreen, and actually not answering my question. I want now to open the floor to people here in the room or people online. We have quite a distinguished audience here in the room and online. I'm sure people are burning with questions. So I'm more than happy now to open the floor. There is a microphone circulating there with Stephanie and potentially also questions in the chat that my colleague Alexander can relay. So if you have any question, please raise your hand. Or Alexander, let me know if there is any question coming up online. Maybe I threw too many questions at the same time. That's probably also the case. Alex.
From online, but I'm happy to ask one to break the ice a little bit.
Please, Alex.
Sure. Is it okay? Yeah, great. Mark, you gave a really interesting sort of retrospective of the last 20 years. I wanted to see if we could broaden the aperture a little bit and go back to the Afghan war and particularly American Western support for the Afghans against Russian aggression there. And specifically to think about the consequences of that were very clear on our post 9/11 reality. We are now supporting another government against Russian aggression. Do we have any lessons to draw from history? Is it a different context? How should we situate the war in Ukraine in that historical context?
Well, that's a difficult one. Actually, I had not thought about this comparison. I thought more about the consequences of the war in Syria. There will be probably many and for years to come, and that's one of the reasons why terrorism and CT should not be forgotten. When you realize that the war in Afghanistan produced effects until today, the war in Syria will probably produce effects for a generation. Now the comparison with Ukraine, that's a difficult one. I think I have to think more about it. My spontaneous reply would be that it's really a different context, a different kind also of conflict, and that we shouldn't be too, we shouldn't jump to conclusions too quickly. But perhaps I have to think about it more deeply to provide a better answer. Well, one thing, but that would be very unpopular to say that today, is that when you send weapons to a country at some point, they might come back. Plus, there's the issue of foreign fighters as well. But so far, the figures are not that high. But then if you look at the conflict in Afghanistan, it's very, I recommend you the reading of two books. The first one is The Caravan by Thomas Agamer, the biography of Abdullah Azzam. And the second one is the Bin Laden Papers, because you realize that actually at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, there were quite few foreign fighters as well. They really started to arrive at the mid-1980s. So already after a few years into the conflict, so we'll never see we'll never know. Well, we cannot know now, at least, how the war in Ukraine will evolve, and perhaps it may attract more foreign fighters. But again, that's not very popular to say these kind of things now.
Daring to wade in just on that point, because I know it's a very thorny issue, and certainly when we wrote about it at the Soufan Center earlier this year, a lot of people challenged us for raising the T word in the context of Ukraine. But I think we do have a few lessons learned. We know weapons can go to different places than you intended. We also know people get changed by their experiences, and that once you're in a conflict zone, the dynamics can change. So on the issue of learning lessons from previous conflicts, I think there's a lot of differences between the context, but we do know some of the importance about, tracking who's going, maybe planning for their return a bit better, knowing some of the risks when even a few people come back, whether it's their own experience has hardened them, whether they come with PTSD or grievances against their own country at home, right? They might, so I think those are, while they're different contexts, we can certainly learn some of the lessons from foreign fighters and returnees that we did previously. And I think that's part of addressing that bureaucratic amnesia. We shouldn't be afraid to plan for all scenarios early on. That I think is the key takeaway.
Thank you. We have a question here, Stephanie, and then a second one. Yeah, I'll see. If you can maybe quickly just introduce yourself before asking a question so the panel knows who is speaking.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion so far. My name is Morgan Fincha. Is the sound okay? Yeah. I'm a researcher with the Expo Foundation. It's a CSO based in Stockholm in Sweden, where tomorrow a major trial is set to begin against the terrorist, the confessed terrorist who recently murdered, back in July, murdered a high-level civil servant. And the trial is set to begin tomorrow, as I said, but we already know that he is a former member of the Nordic resistance movement, clearly motivated, clearly shaped by right-wing extremist ideology. So in Sweden, at the moment, we're very conscious of the continuing threat of right-wing extremism and terrorism. And you mentioned that CT is now, in an overall sense, being downgraded as a policy issue. You've also noted the fact that right-wing extremism, right-wing terrorism is on the rise, even as religiously motivated terrorism is receding somewhat. So can you talk about what are the main concerns that you have, going forward, given these given these factors that CT is being downgraded at a time when right-wing extremism is still very much a menace, even in EU countries? Thank you.
Well, first, CT is downgraded as a geopolitical issue, but if you take the example of France, it's still considered as very important domestically. So there's still a very important focus on these issues within the Ministry of Interior, for instance. And France is often pointed at for being perhaps too focused on Islamism and not enough on right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism. I'm not sure it's a fair criticism, because the Ministry of Interior really tries to tackle the different ideologies and different radical groups and terrorist groups. So that being said, I think that if we continue that way with very few attacks on Western soil, it will also be downgraded domestically. And then the risk will be to miss an important plot, as we missed other plots in the past. So you didn't ask me the question about positive things. I think that one of the positive things perhaps is that there were a few instances in the past where the West globally, but it's the case of the US, the case of France as well, overreacted. And the fact that terrorism is downgraded, given the overreaction of the past, is not necessarily a bad news, but it's a question of balance. If we go too far and we end up underestimating the threat, then of course it will be a negative outcome. So it's very difficult now, because basically we have to find the right balance, not to invest too much and overreact to certain aspects, but also not to miss important plots that could be developing.
And I would add to that that even though maybe not in France, in some European countries, I think counterterrorism is, if not necessarily downgraded, there are more issues that are requiring attention from the same services, from intelligence, law enforcement services, whether espionage, whether organized crime, whether other types of issues. So clearly there is more pressure on the services to do, as you were saying earlier, more things with maybe less resources. And that's true internationally, but I think that's also increasingly true domestically.
Okay, I have an anecdote about that. I had the opportunity recently to talk to a former head of an intelligence agency in France. And he was talking about the pressure after the Bataclan attacks and the one that followed, and there were several, as you know. And he said, at the time, I had to dedicate 100% of the resources to CT. But this service is also in charge of counter-espionage. And I said, but when you say 100%, I guess it's not 100%. And he said, well, when you have the Bataclan and other attacks like the Bastille Day attack in Nice, basically you have so much pressure that you have to dedicate almost 100% to counterterrorism. And now, of course, with the war in Ukraine, you have another effect, is that you have to dedicate resources to counter-espionage. We know that it's an issue with Russia, so we kept resources, of course. It was not 100%, but again, it's a question of balance. So now we have to strike the right balance between CT, counter-espionage, and other issues.
To your question about the right-wing threat and international responses, I think how the threat evolves will shape where countries put resources, right? So ISIS, Al-Qaeda were deemed a threat to international peace and security. Hence, you saw the requisite response sort of from the Security Council. So I think what we'll see if the threat continues to be as it is, that maybe attention is raised on the international level, but the actions and the kind of policy prescriptions are very much nationally based. We know there are some transnational connections between right-wing groups. I think if we start to see operational connections resulting in more internationalized attacks, you'll see it, again, warrant a kind of different international response. I did want to say, however, that, the current international framework, like under the UN, addresses terrorism, so, in all its forms and manifestations is the policy term. And there's a number of things that can be used by states themselves. There's a number of countering the financing of terrorism obligations and resources. There's counter narratives, obligations, resources. So it's not that the international framework has no resources that can be used to address the right-wing threat. It exists. It's how states use them.
We have a question, Bibi, but there was a question before from Richard. Maybe we can take the two questions, group them together to make sure that we can address them both. Again, Richard, if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Hi, Richard McNeil-Wilson. I'm a research fellow at the University of Leiden, just over the road. A very quick and easy question, just to take the discussion on the downgrading of threats to its kind of extremity. Are we at the end of the war on terror? And do you envisage a point in time when we no longer need counterterrorism?
And maybe we take Bibi's question as well at the same time.
Thank you, and thank you to both the speakers. I was actually also thinking about the fact that if CT is no longer, or terrorism no longer, the priority on the agenda, that also may take off the pressure a little bit in terms of the proliferation of CT, CVE, PVE programs that were sometimes pervertedly pushed into that particular box, whereas it was more about development aid, more about rule of law, more about capacity building. But for a long period of time, everything needs to be labeled as addressing violent extremism, and that has also sort of perverted those programs. So maybe taking the pressure off also gives a little bit breathing space for those programs, which is also our way forward in terms of keeping investments going in what addresses basically underlying factors of potentially radicalization.
Thanks. Maybe start with Noreen for a change.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Are we I think we are at the end of the global war on terror. but I don't think we're at the end of counterterrorism is the short answer. I think, as we discussed, the sort of global effort to address this transnational threat is going to take different forms. I think the real danger is if it becomes the end of counterterrorism, because I don't think terrorism as a threat individually by states or anything will disappear. I think the scale and the nature of it may change. Again, I caveat that carefully, because on September 10th, 2001, the big problem was that we hadn't invested enough in counterterrorism and understanding what would come. So I do think it's the end of the global war on terror, and thankfully in many ways, but I would caution against it being the end of counterterrorism as well, for all the reasons we've talked about today. The threat exists, and just because we don't see it in the US homeland or Europe as much doesn't mean that if you're sitting in a hotspot in Africa or somewhere where it may next emerge, or Southeast Asia, that terrorism is gone completely. I do think there are some concerns about the blurring of the term, and I think as we start looking at how it's evolving in Africa and how people talk about state-sponsored terrorism and things like that, I think the terminology will become even more contentious, but I think GWAT, thankfully, we can hopefully retire the term. To Bibi's question, comment, reflection, I think I would worry that the end of CT on that level also means the end of that program budget. So I don't know that because you see a downgrading in CT, you'll suddenly see more thoughtful investment in development or resilience building or some of the PCVE work. Like, I don't think some of the budget lines for PCVE will remain absent the emphasis on CT. And I think the CT actors who are facing some pressure, not always welcome, to do more prevention work and investment in the kind of PCV work you're talking about. I think with the absence of pressure to do CT, the absence of pressure to do that kind of work might also happen. So I see your point. I'm just cautious about whether the, reduction in resources for CT in the PCV space will mean that there's more resources for PCV. I might be wrong, and I'm looking at Mina just to see if I get an answer, but I think that that's the risk.
We agree with the strategic vision, the end of the global war on terror, but not the end of CT. I'll add a bureaucratic note. It's very hard to kill institutions. So we have anti-terrorist unit, and they will remain. They may be reduced, their funding may be reduced, but they will remain. For PVE, CVE, at least from a French lens, we have outsourced a lot. And it's much easier to kill institutions that have been outsourced. I think that's even one of the reasons why we outsource. If the threat changes, if we need flexibility, basically, and that's why we outsource. And if there's less funding, then you kill the institution. So basically, CT, I think, will remain, will adapt, but will remain. CVE, PVE, I think it will really depend on the contexts, on the national context. In France, I'm not that sure that it will remain forever. Let's see, in a generation from now, I'm pretty sure that we'll still have CT. I'm not sure we'll have PVE, CVE, but maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you. We have one question there, and maybe also one question from online, and I think then it will be time to close. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Susanna Conrad. I'm working as a policy analyst on security issues on Sub-Saharan Africa for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Actually, I would like to bring back or shed the light back on West Africa, because what we're seeing at the moment is it's a huge spread of terrorist attacks coming from Mali to Burkina Faso to the countries of the Gulf of Guinea. And actually, I was wondering, because it's related to to rebirth of the Islamic State on the continent. And I was thinking, or I was wondering, in how far could this have been an impact also on the security situation in Europe? Because I think when we look to the Islamic State, to the ISWAP and to the ISCAP, so to the western part of the Islamic State, and also to the central province of the Islamic State, you see they are building up an infrastructure on the whole continent. And I don't think that we are, finalizing the war against the terrorist attacks. We see that rebirthing in Western Africa again, and it's not Afghanistan. Afghanistan was far away from us, but West Africa is not far away from Europe. So I think the security situation does have an impact really also on the security situation in Europe. And I was wondering if you can give some ideas what we can do to tackle the issue of the terrorist threat in West Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Alex, can we echo a question from online, or maybe the person?
The online speaker asked the question, and it is directly related to this question, so they pair nicely by coincidence. So thanks.
Can we have the question from the person online?
Just read it out. I'm not looking to shall I do that? Okay. So the question was indeed focused on terror groups moving, indeed, in the spillover context towards the coastal regions of West Africa. How much of that is a voluntary movement, and how much of that is forced by different military operations and other strategic priorities? How can CT operations in the coastal West African states learn from what did and didn't work in their neighbors to try and counter the threat as it moves towards them? I think is the crux of that question.
I mean, I think some of the discussion earlier about PCV and all is, part of the answer, because not everything that's driving terrorism or support for terrorist groups in Africa is not necessarily warranting a counterterrorism response, right? It's generally warranting greater investment in anti-corruption and governance, in security sector reform and things like that. So I think the answer to some of the terrorism in Africa is in fact more assistance along those lines. I agree, and that's why we are tracking very much that these groups aren't dead in the water. Absolutely, they are recruiting. They're very powerful on a local and regional basis. But then perhaps that's where the conversation on working more with regional and sub-regional organizations who are more closely involved in tracking it on the ground, working with communities on the ground, is going to be more and more of the answer. And I think that is also a direction for European investment in preventing the threat on the continent. That's important to think about. I don't know if that, you gave me a minute, so I don't know if that helps address both questions in a way. And just very quickly, in lessons learned, we've certainly seen that a big driver of extremism on the continent is the human rights violations and actions of state actors and security services. So as states that are newly developing a response to terrorist threat, I think that's a number one lesson learned. Don't drive your citizens into the arms of terrorist groups.
Exactly what I was about to say. There's a difference between insurgency and terrorism. In the Sahel now, there's an open insurgency. The difference is the support of the population. The population is really the key, the center of the gravity of the conflict, and you have to avoid a terrorist group trying to attract them. And so human rights is definitely an important aspect, but then you also have to try and address the grievances of the population. So it's above all a political question, a question of governance, and here it's really the local states that have to do the job. I mean, we can try and reinforce their institutions, but if they don't do the job, then we'll fail again.
Thank you very much. I mean, in light of the time, I suggest we take a break here in this first day of the annual conference. Thank you, everyone in the audience for participating and raising questions. Thank you to everyone who participated online. This is the end of the first plenary session, but not the end of ICCT's annual conference. There is another day tomorrow. We will have more conversation in workshop formats and also another plenary session tomorrow afternoon with our keynote speaker, EU Counter-Terrorism Coordinator Ilke Salmi, and another plenary panel on the impacts of these geopolitical upheavals on the human rights counterterrorism agenda. So thank you very much, Noreen. Thank you very much, Mark. In spite of my best efforts to corner you, I didn't manage. You had answers to all of my questions. I didn't lie. I had brilliant minds with me here on the panel. It was a real pleasure. Please join me in a round of applause to thank our panelists. For those here in the room, there is now a nice networking moment with a drink. For those online, please feel free to crack a beer open and have a virtual drink with us. And otherwise, we will see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.